Hello and welcome to this webinar presented on behalf of Employee Ownership Australia. My name is Jess Mitchell. I'm a Global Employee Equity Consultant and Australasia Lead for law firm Tapestry Compliance, and I'm also a Director and Co-Chair of the EOA Board. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands that we're meeting on today. EOA pays our respects to elders, past and present, and we extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So today's webinar will present the findings and the progress in some exciting research focusing on employee ownership schemes in Australia. This is exciting because although we have a thriving industry and a passionate community, we don't have an abundance of recent high-quality research on employee ownership in this country. So it's a really important contribution at a pivotal point. Our primary presenter today is Zeb Holmes, who is a senior employment lawyer, a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales, and the recipient of an EOA grant to assist with this research. Zeb's doctorate is supervised by Andrew Pendleton, who is an EOA board director and also Professor of Employee Ownership and Reward at UNSW. Andrew holds a number of other positions at prestigious universities internationally, and last year he was the joint winner of the Nigel Mason Award for Employee Ownership Research. Thank you for listening in today, and I hope you find the webinar valuable. If you're not already a member of EOA, please do consider joining to enjoy a host of benefits, as well as supporting the movement to increase and facilitate employee ownership across Australian companies. There's a link to join on the EOA website, and we'll also include that in the follow-up email with the recording of today's webinar. And of course, please feel free to get in touch with any questions around membership or about employee ownership in general. I'll now hand over to Zeb to present the latest from his research. Thanks, Zeb.
Great, thanks, Jessica. I'll just quickly share my screen with everybody. And great slide show. All right, should all be able to see the PowerPoint there, but shout out if there's any issues. Thank you so much, EOA, for having me. As Jessica explained, today I'm going to run through my research, which is happening in partnership with EOA. As a very high-level introductions, might be surplus to requirements, but just to make sure everyone is on the same page, employee ownership is pretty much what it sounds like when employees own part or all of the corporate entity that is their employer. Common scenarios are employees holding shares in the employer, a trust holding the shares for the benefit of employees, or a co-op distributing ownership through membership rights. And those are the focus of my research. I'll give you a rundown of the 3 studies which make up the PhD before explaining the results that have already come in for study 1 and the status of studies 2 and 3, what we've got already and what needs to be done still. Moving on, for study 1, I've interviewed business owners, remuneration experts, and HR to review both variations in employee ownership schemes and at a high level, the basis for company decision-making about the scheme. For study 2, I'll be analysing survey data, which has been completed and returned by workers in the UK and Australia to test a model of the effects of employee ownership as well as related HR practices on employee attitudes and behaviour. In study 3, I'll be interviewing contacts from certain unions and employer associations to test their views about employee ownership and how they might impact policy or design of employee ownership. So just as a general update, I've conducted the interviews and done some of the analysis for study 1. A good amount of data has come back for study 2, with some still remaining. I haven't analysed that data yet, but have some hypotheses and a model to test from previous research. For study 3, we're moving to ethics approval now, so I'll be carrying out those interviews pretty shortly. As I have analysed study 1, the results so far, I'll discuss them now before going through the data still required for study 2 and 3. For study one, I talked to just under 25 companies. There was a good mix between some small cooperatives, some mid-sized specialist firms like consultants or IT, and then much larger manufacturing or tech companies. We developed a typology which combines the share scheme itself and the surrounding workplace HR practices or culture. To understand this, we need to set out the two aspects of employee ownership that we're looking at. There is one, the extent of the shared financial incentives in an employee ownership scheme, and two, the nature of the surrounding workplace practices. Now, this is a whole presentation by itself, but to give some very quick context, there is a lot of research on the interaction between these things. Basically, just having employee share ownership is good, although effects on employee attitudes and behavior is quite small and inconsistent, and in rare cases can even be a net negative. However, when you combine employee ownership in terms of the shared financial incentives with complementary work practices, the effects are much greater, and that's when you really see good returns if you're looking at making employees more productive, proactive, innovative, committed, all of those good things that we want. So some of the work practices identified in the literature are participatory decision making, a safe climate to raise issues and ideas, access to company information, and relevant management training. To put it succinctly, you get the best results when you have one, shared financial incentives being the personal material motivation to increase company profits, but you also combine that with two, systems which make employees feel that even in small ways, they do have a personal role in driving those company profits, or systems that improve their ability to do so. So, having gone through that, I will come to how we analysed the data for study one. Now, on the side of shared financial incentives, we broke it down into two separate share plan design features: percentage of employee participants and percentage of employee equity. So my supervisor is still in discussions on the exact cutoff points once we fully analyze the data, but it may be somewhere around 20% of workers eligible for the plan and 50% of total company equity available to employees. That might be an idea where if you're above those thresholds, you meet the high ownership characterization in both conditions, and below you would be low ownership threshold. Obviously, there's just binary. There's a scale in between, but that's sort of a helpful characterization just for our purposes. Now, those companies with low ownership thresholds tended to be those where eligibility was limited to either very senior staff or other high performers, or the shares had a long probation period. Total equity given to employers was also fairly low in large companies, pretty commonly around 15%. There were some large companies, though, who were quite ideologically connected to employee ownership and retained high ownership levels. Now we can see the 2 by 2 matrix this creates in the slide with different schemes marked A, B, C, and D. Now, when we're then looking at complementary workplace practices, the features that I mentioned previously, being participation, access to information, etc., they're all part of what the research calls ownership high performance work practices. So we're looking for companies that emphasize those practices as an integral part of the scheme's performance. For those companies, we designated that they were complementary of an ownership mindset, with others being potentially non-complementary, although that would also include neutral work practices, just anything that wasn't complementary. So there was a distinction between the schemes that were treated as financial products and those which were treated as what we called employee experience products. So unsupportive schemes administered through the finance or REM team only, which were treated as pure equity with little real employee participation. Supportive schemes had some HR integration and measurement and helped employees perceive that they had some practical ownership rights, such as involvement in decision making, consultation, and information access. So, from all this, we get the following typology of possible employee ownership. So, A, B, C, and D are the different types of shared financial incentives we mentioned. And there's a distinction between places where broader company practices are complementary to an ownership mindset or not. So the color included here is just an estimation of how the different types might impact employee attitudes and behavior across the whole office, with red being a small effect, um, and for A, a potentially for category A, a potentially negative effect. Um, Orange is good, but limited effect, and green is a likely significant positive effect. So that's where you sort of combine um, a specific type of share scheme with a complementary HR feature. Now, the next thing we went through, sort of having created this typology, um, is the company's aims for their schemes. So the responses from companies could be categorized as in the following, acknowledging there's some crossover between the different aims. So one is down the bottom, going from bottom to top here, is company financial benefits. And that's where the scheme is focused on improving cash flow by, for example, replacing regular salary payments with equity investments, or the scheme aims to make the business easier to sell or more attractive as an asset. So it's just purely financially based for the company. Two, employee workplace benefits, where the scheme aims to provide wealth to employees or better working conditions. Three, where there's ownership mindset benefits, where the scheme aims to create psychological changes in employees where they act more characteristic of owners, said to relate to better performance, accountability, productivity, and engagement, things like that. And four are human capital benefits. So, where the scheme aims to retain existing employees or attract new employees to the business. As we see on the slide, the most cited aims were connected. Well, most companies cited the share scheme as being connected to an ownership mindset, in that share schemes will solve the agency problem in the traditional conflict of interest between employee and employer by making them both materially interested in increasing company profit. But the interesting thing, having set this out, is that um, there's some reason to think that companies might be overestimating how much employees are motivated by small shared financial incentives and underemphasizing how much they are impacted by the surrounding workplace culture or norms, which may support or not support those incentives. This is because most companies seem to be implementing financial oriented plans without other practices supporting an ownership mindset. Most schemes were conceptualized in pure financial terms, and they were not helped by HR efforts or measures, and were not iterated in terms of employee experience, seemingly assuming that an ownership mindset would occur simply through instituting the plan itself. So next we move to the reasons for this distinction. So from talking to share plan insiders, a few factors help explain why a scheme and its aims may not line up. Particularly, we have advisor influence, industry mimicry, and internal culture. And I'll just go through each of those quickly, which all come out from our results of study one. So the first issue, particularly for smaller companies, was the complexity of share schemes generally and the need to rely substantially on external advisors. Now, if these companies did not have enough knowledge of the area, they may have, particularly in the first iteration of the plan, um, not really being able to articulate their individual needs, and as a result, sort of received a boilerplate plan. Um, Larger companies can be insulated by this issue, although international companies had a different issue in needing plans that were consistent with another jurisdiction's preference or laws, but generally they knew where things could be tailored for local circumstances. What did impact medium and large companies, though, was pressure from industry competition. Now, these companies rightly see themselves in a competition for top talent, saying that employees expect certain benefits. So there's a bit of safety in doing what Google is doing, just to use an example from the software industry. So another company might not think it's 100% right for them to follow that lead, but they're worried what potential hires expect in a share plan. So they're confident that they can explain, sorry, they're not confident that they can explain why something different will work better for their company. And it's just much easier and safer to say, well, this is what Google does and this is what we're doing. For smaller companies, they have a different type of pressure still, which is that particularly for co-ops, they occupy a niche kind of pro-social space where there are expectations about their plan. This largely coincided with their stated aims or culture around the plan, but it would be interesting if this study was more longitudinal, so occurring over a few years, whether any of those smaller companies grew and needed to change some um, inefficiencies of their work practices, which we often see when companies move from a direct democratic one member, one vote structure to some more standard representative democratic system. Now, finally, there was an appreciation that deeper organizational culture might support or hinder the aims of the plan. So, in organizational culture research, there is the idea of levels of culture. There's more uh, surface level values that you say are important, and then there's a deeper culture of what's called taken for granted assumptions. So these are so fundamental, particularly or often in the reward structure, that they basically go unsaid. So in some cases, they might be inconsistent, where, say, a company um, espouses that safety is their number one concern, but then every worker is assessed and remunerated purely by reference to their production schedules. So everyone understands that speed is actually the number one concern, regardless of what we say to the externally. Now, in in this case, some companies wanted a more participatory ownership mindset, uh, using the plan as a jumping off point for that, but they had a bit contradictory hierarchical systems. So, despite best intentions, employees didn't think that it was really their role to think and act like owners, despite having some shared financial interests. Um, and this came across particularly where there was a vague notion that we want employees to come up with great ideas and help the company profit, but there was no distinct forum to do that, or help with company information or training or time or workload concessions or anything else done to assist in that goal. So um, it didn't seem as genuine as it could have. On the other end of the spectrum, some companies had such a strong complementary organizational culture that it buffered some of the external institutional pressures that I previously mentioned. These were companies which could say, we're going to implement a certain type of scheme, regardless of what investors say and regardless of what another company is doing. So it was sometimes the case that deeper organizational culture caused firms to drift from their employee ownership vision, and sometimes it allowed them to stay true to it despite external pressures. So it is important to consider where the scheme fits into the broader workplace culture and whether that needs to be massaged at all. So, with that, as a wrap up to study one, the main findings, just a big summary, related to one, establishing a typology of employee ownership that combines both the features of the share plan and whether the surrounding workplace is complementary. Two, assessing the most common aims of employee ownership to be compared to the actual implementation of employee ownership, and three, gauging the internal and external pressures which determine a company's scheme and whether this will be consistent with its aims. So that's the main thrust of my study one analysis. And now just touch on my broader progress for studies two and three. So study two, as I mentioned, carrying out a survey into the effects of employee ownership on employee attitudes and behaviour. So we're still getting the data back now, and we haven't analysed it yet, although a good amount has come back. From my literature review, we developed the below model that we're hoping to test. So I can't get through every individual concept now, but I'll give a bit of an explainer. Feel free to ask any questions afterwards if you want to know what all these boxes and arrows mean more precisely. But essentially, on the left, we have the company actions of the employee ownership scheme and the ownership high performance work systems, which are those sort of HR practices that I mentioned. So they, according to the research, will combine to create a sense of psychological ownership of the company. So a feeling that, I have a psychological investment. The company is ours. It's something sort of under our control. Now, this psychological ownership is impacted by employee attributions as a moderator. And these are the perceptions of why a company adopts certain practices. So it could be to enhance employee well-being or just to reduce labor costs, to take two ends of the spectrum. So if we combine employee ownership, HR practices, and if employees have good attribution of those two things, these company actions should create psychological ownership for the company. Next, psychological contract breach is when an employee thinks that the employer has failed to fulfill its obligations and promises. So if there is no breach, high psychological ownership should lead to the behavioral outcomes on the right, being better performance of their job, better extra role behaviors, also known as organizational citizenship behaviors, and longer retention. Altogether, this model tracks the process of the company treating its employees like owners, then feeling like an owner through psychological ownership, and then acting like an owner. So, having gone through the model, we sent out surveys that test each element to companies in Australia following my interviews, and also the UK, thanks to contacts from Andrew. After that analysis, we will hopefully see how employee ownership impacts employee attitudes and behaviors. Now, finally, I'll quickly go through the idea for study three because it's still in early development. Essentially, we plan to interview those in unions and employer associations with some link to employee ownership. We want to know how these organizations perceive employee ownership and how they may seek to impact employee ownership policies or its implementation in specific businesses. So there's pretty significant stakeholders there. We are still building the theoretical basis for study three, and we'll be making an ethics application shortly to get those interviews. Now, we feel pretty good about our ability to get that data, but if anyone has any contacts in unions or employer associations, that would be very helpful if you could pass those along to myself or Andrew. On that point, it would also, I guess, be remiss of me to say that while we do have some data back for study two, if you are involved in a company or know a company that might want to take part in the study two survey, there's still room for that if you send those contacts. Now, the benefit for any companies involved is that by testing this model, they may be able to know whether their employee ownership scheme is actually having the psychological and behavioral effects that they hope they do. And it's actually quite tricky to measure the effect of employee ownership because if you don't take into consideration sort of a holistic model like this, there's a problem of a reverse causation. So if you just look at employee ownership and you look at results, you don't actually know whether good companies are instituting employee ownership or employee ownership makes good companies. So that's, I guess, the sell we've given to the companies to give their data over to study too. Um, so the more data, the better. If anyone wants to pass on those details, my quick little data plug. So that is about it for my update. In about 25 minutes, I've managed to summarize much of the last 3 years of my life in doing this PhD. So hopefully that gives you an insight into my research and what we hope to gain from it in terms of our knowledge of employee ownership. Thanks again to EOA for the chance to present, and Andrew and I are happy to take any questions that came up during the presentation. I go back to you, Jessica.
Hi Zeb, can you see me?
Yep, all good.
Just one question from me for you and maybe for Andrew as well is in what you've in your findings so far and everything that you've learned and read, has there been any surprises for you in what you anticipated? And also, has there been anything that's not aligned or is more inconsistent or is more unique to Australia in comparison with all the research that Andrew's been involved with and that you've read, particularly in the UK and the US?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first one, and maybe Andrew, if you want to talk about the alignment, having a bit more experience on sort of the international operation of of the plans. I mean, in terms of the study, in terms of the first study, I guess what surprised me was the consistency in which companies discussed the aims of their share plan, and then contrasting this with the inconsistency of how the plans are designed and actually operate. So it was fairly universal that people want certain changes in employee attitudes and behavior. And I guess I, coming in, assumed that there was a certain process that was understood as leading to those results, but there are so many factors that go into um, how employee ownership scheme is instituted, both of internally in terms of organizational culture, but externally in terms of market pressures. Um, that it was interesting to see the divergence there in how schemes are actually instituted. Um, that was a surprise to me, I guess.
You were asking me, Jessica, about differences between Australia and the rest of the world. Just a couple of things I'd mention now. One is that although share schemes in large listed companies are quite well developed in Australia, the approved limits for how much employees can receive in terms of shares is quite low by UK or American standards. For instance, the $1,000 tax exemption for gifted shares that really is relatively low by international standards. So at the EOA, we've been calling for these limits to be increased. The other thing, a perennial issue in Australia is the lack of official data on employee share schemes. It seems that one parliamentary or government inquiry after another has called for more and better quality data on employee ownership in Australia. But unfortunately, we're still waiting. So that's why I think Zeb's work is so important, in that he's helping to close the evidence gap that we have here in Australia.
Thank you both. I think that's really helpful, and I can see we've had a number of other questions pop up in the chat box. If you're happy to address those.
So Zeb, Yolanda is asking about the organisational structures that are supportive of employee participation, and she wondered if there's any structures that stand out in your research.
Structures supportive. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is quite a lot of different ways to do it, I guess, and it does does depend on the individual company's needs. I mean, um, for quite small companies, like someone alluded to this in the discussion of co-ops, there is an ability to sort of have that extreme level of consultation where, you know, there's near unanimous decision making and collaboration there. But once you get to a certain size, that just becomes not very feasible at all. Or the decisions that will be made will just take a very long time. So when you look at employee participation in those structures, the type of things that often came out was an employee representative on the board that can feed back, you know, high level strategic information back to employees and make everyone feel included. You know, regular town halls on where the company is going, and invitations for feedback, and workshops of that nature, and access to company information is quite important to actually make that feasible. So those are the things that often come across, and then of course, sort of in smaller, you might be able to replicate a more direct feature of employee participation in the smaller work teams, and then just have a more representative system for the whole of organization decisions. If that someone answers the question.
Okay, while you catch your breath for a second or two, Zeb, I've got another couple of questions here from the chat, which are quite similar, though to different sides of the same coin, perhaps. Andrew McDougall asks whether your research will measure the extent to which share plans and complementary practices contribute to employees actually behaving like owners rather than just being treated like them. And at the same time, we've got a question from Alan Gregg asking, do you see a developing mindset that employee share ownership is not much more than a financial instrument to attract and retain key staff?
Yeah, sure. So on the first question, yes, we will be measuring the extent to which financial incentives and complementary practices contribute to employees acting like owners. Now, what we have, there's a lot of things that could fall into that basket of acting like an owner. The behaviors that we have put there are things that we think can be measured and do sort of fit that definition, which is performing well in your role, sort of taking some accountability for the organization as a whole in extra role behaviors. So sort of going above and beyond is the stereotype, and feeling embedded in the company, so staying for longer. So, I mean, it isn't the easiest thing to completely measure the phrase acting like owners, but we're trying to capture it through role performance, extra role behaviors, and retention. So we have part of the survey is things that will go to each of those measures. So at the end, there should be sort of a flow-on effect that we can see where a certain score for being treated like an owner equates to a certain score for feeling like an owner, and then equates to a certain score for um, those behaviors that I just mentioned. So that's the goal. Gold standard. Hopefully everything goes as planned, but we'll see what happens with the data. And in answer to your question, Alan, I mean, interestingly enough, I see a. Oh, sorry, the question just moved. I see a. I don't really see a mindset that that companies are that pessimistic toward. I feel like companies are quite optimistic towards employee share ownership in that they think it can do everything and isn't just a financial instrument to attract and retain staff. But that was sort of the surprising fact that I alluded to earlier, which is that when it comes to the actual implementation or operationalization of the plan, um, that seems to be what is being communicated, that it's a financial instrument to attract and retain key staff, and that would be the primary effect. But a lot of companies that I talked to thought, no, this will actually, everyone will see the light and will be invigorated by this plan. Um, so it might just be more a matter of understanding what um, the different avenues for employee ownership that are available, and if you do want that all-encompassing plan, what are the avenues to get there in a more um, expansive or creative scheme rather than one that only is an attraction and retention feature.
Zeb, there's a similar question, I think, also from Yolanda, uh, asking about whether you were looking to the psychology of human motivation systems. And she points out that incentives tap into extrinsic motivations, whereas participation in decisions in work design and so on taps more intrinsic. And she wonders whether there could be a conflict between the two.
Yes, that is a good question. There's quite an influential paper by Klein, sort of late 80s, I think it might have been 87, that goes into there's, I mean, the sort of two leading theories on employee ownership effects are extrinsic and intrinsic theories. And um, from my findings is similar to what you've asked, Yolanda, which is that um, if you only have intrinsic motivation, you'll do better. If you only have extrinsic motivation, you'll sorry. If you only have extrinsic motivation, you'll do a little bit better, but it is inconsistent. If you have intrinsic motivation, that is that will create a better outcome. But as I mentioned, although only quite briefly, it is the combination of these things that really unlocks the potential of employee ownership, where you have both a financial motivation and a perceived means to work towards it in a way that also, um, I guess, appreciates the value and autonomy and empowerment of each individual worker. So I think I think we've got the extrinsic motivation kind of down, and everyone understands that. But there's a fairly common experience that the intrinsic element doesn't quite meet the same standards. So hopefully it'll be included. I think it will make the cut.
Okay, changing tack a little bit, Zeb. Paul Klink asks whether your study, and this would be study one, I guess, does your study look at how companies originally found out about employee ownership and what originally attracted them to it?
Yeah, yes. It's fine. Just as an aside, I was worried that at the end of this discussion there would be no questions. Now, um, I'm worried about the alternative of getting through all these questions, but it's nice to see. Um, yes, the study does look at how companies originally found out about employee ownership, I guess in a roundabout way, um, in how that relates to the company's aims in implementing employee ownership and the workplace culture that surrounded their implementation. So, um, I mean, part part of the theory around workplace culture is organizational culture is a system of shared understandings that develops from companies solving historical problems and recognizing the quote unquote correct way to think about problems. So, in a way, the history of coming in contact with employee ownership is quite instructive when we look at a company's aims and what motivates them. Um, so it won't be a headline topic in terms of what originally attracted them, but it often comes out that um, a company will say we were going down this road for a while. It just we just hadn't unlocked the potential of our people, and I came across this article, and it was a you know it seemed like the way to go, um, or um, alternatively, I wanted to make the company more valuable for a potential succession plan. And so those two things communicate two fairly different approaches to how you might institute a scheme. So that came out quite frequently, and it does play a large role in the aims and motivations around employee ownership.
If I can just add to that from the UK, the audience may be familiar with the very significant growth that's taken place in employee ownership in the UK in the last 5 years or so, and in particular the growth of the employee ownership trust. And there's a couple of factors there about how companies learn this stuff. One is what other companies in the particular company's sector is doing. So, a very similar company to your own adopts employee ownership, then that sort of gets it onto your radar and may well increase the chances of converting to employee ownership. And we see in trade publications, in architecture, construction, and so on, fairly regular articles now on employee ownership, and this helps to spread the word, as it were, within particular sectors. The other thing worth mentioning about the UK is that because the tax benefits of the EOT were so good until quite recently, it put it onto the agenda of professional advisors in a big way, to the extent that if an advisor was advising on business succession, for instance, they'd really be they wouldn't be very diligent if they didn't mention employee ownership. as a possible route for the company that they're advising. So it's a very interesting area, I think. Let me move on to some more questions, unless you want to follow up there at all, Zeb.
Just the only other point I realized I probably should have mentioned that those matters will also be touched upon by study, well, may be touched upon by study 3, and that we haven't got the data yet, but it'll be relevant, as Andrew was talking about, sort of trade publications and training and institutional mimicry. How do large stakeholder bodies see employee ownership throughout the economy functioning? So if it was the case that we talk to employer associations and they think there's this problem and this problem, it's not really on their radar, that might be relevant to the things that could change to allow like a broader dissemination of this as an accepted practice potentially.
Okay, one or two more questions are in the chat. The first one from Martine Lefebvre, who asks whether you've looked into the company matching component of share plan offers.
Probably not at that level of specificity, I would say. I mean, for this research, it's probably more sort of look at it in a more holistic sense. I mean, it did come up when companies were talking about the type of plan and design that they're instituting, but I would need to go back to that sort of raw early data to comment on that, because what we've been looking at for a while in analysing the data is more, as I said, what's the total percentage going to employees, and what's the eligibility criteria, things like that. So, in terms of those kind of technical differences in plans, that was part of the very early research, but has since been maybe filtered out a little bit in favour of more holistic statistics.
Okay, we've got some more questions. One from Michelle Brown about the age of a share plan. And she asks, do you think the age of a share plan makes a difference to how effective it is? Are new schemes more likely to generate positive outcomes versus more established plans? I don't know whether your researchers can cast any light on that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my research won't be able to, just because of the well, it might be able to in a correlational sense, looking at the different companies that respond, the age of their share plan and the results, but because it will only be at one point in time, we won't really be able. It'll be somewhat of a guess whether those two variables are related. It would be great to be able to have a more longitudinal research piece that looks at a share plan over time. We were thinking about that at one stage, with just the practical difficulties of a PhD and the length of time that runs for, meant that we needed to go in a different direction, and we can only look at the share plan at one point in time and look at the relationship between the variables there. I can say from my existing research, there is some reason to think that if you were to measure a plan in sort of the first 3 or 6 months, often there's a short-term bump in outcomes, with some suggestions that they plateau or can sometimes even decline when measured again at a 9 to 12 month mark. I think studies by, I can't remember the first name, but Long is the researcher that's done some of that. If you want to look it up, um, and yeah, in some cases even, uh, as I said, the effect, if you kind of pump up the employee ownership plan too much, and then people start to realize that it's not this panacea for all workplace problems. It can start to decline at sort of the 9 or 12 month mark. But if it's instituted as you say it's going to be, and you're kind of consistent in your messaging, then it should be more consistent. But um, there's not there's there's not much research over the longitudinal effect. So it would be good to be able to have that, but yeah, not for this thesis, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'd echo your comments there, Zeb. I'm struggling to think of any research in recent years that systematically examined the impact of the longevity of a scheme on its effectiveness.
Yeah.
Clearly, a case where more research is needed.
Yeah, I think that the research by Long, who's the academic, it would have been around the early 90s or even earlier. And if I remember that correctly, that was sort of a paper looked at effects at the 3 month, 6 month, 9 month, and 12 month mark. But that's very, it would have been looking at a very limited range of companies and who instituted a specific form of scheme. So, yeah, hard to say.
Got, I think, probably the final question from Alan Gregg. Do you have some idea of the total number of employee shareholders in Australia, or how we could estimate that if we don't?
I don't. I thought that, gonna put put you back on the spot. EOA, I thought they were looking at through some freedom of information or some process getting information from the ATO potentially.
Yeah, maybe Jessica, I think, may be involved in that. I don't know whether you could say a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So I think we've mentioned it at a high level before, but EOA, through the board and its experts panel, we've obtained a huge amount of data from the ATO covering employee share scheme participation over a number of years. So we are in the process of clarifying some points around that, and we are going to be presenting that data at some point this year. Hopefully relatively soon. So yes, there's a lot more to come on that. And that was one of the key questions, was how many people, this is obviously in employee share schemes and not in other forms of employee ownership, but how many people in Australia are involved in employee share schemes at the moment and have been over the last few decades really. And hopefully we'll have a much better idea of that soon.
Great. We have well, the questions keep on coming, but I'm conscious that time is marching on. There's a question about attribution in your study too, from Jegu Lee from the United States. Welcome to the talk. He asks, what do you specifically mean by attribution?
Yes, sure. Good question. So attribution is the employer's perception of why a company adopted a practice. So there was an influential paper at some stage sort of added this to the mix, which is to say, essentially a company can take a certain HR practice or action, and the effects of that HR practice or action can be wildly divergent depending on how employees think about it. So, trying to think of another example. I mean, maybe just as sort of an extreme example, you might say, well, we have an employee receives a pay rise, and they may think, um, they really reward my expertise and my input into the company. Or a very cynical employee could be say they just put me above the unfair dismissal cap threshold, and they're about to get rid of me without recourse to unfair dismissal, unfair dismissal in the Fair Work Act. That would be like, extremely cynical example, but just something to say. Two things could have the exact same outcome, but the way an employee thinks about them will actually determine whether or not that translates into changed employee behaviors positively or negatively. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Zeb. We've got one last question, and this really must be the last one. It's from Max Carclins, a long-standing friend and supporter of the EOA, who asks, does your research take into account or differentiate results based on employee seniority?
Yes, I think that will be a control. I think managerial position and whether or not someone manages other employees and their total income level, I think are both things that we've included as demographic questions that will be relevant. I think we've also got age as well, if you mean seniority in that sense. Actually, both are interesting because senior employees sort of have this inbuilt sense of feeling like an owner or having control. So that's something we need to control for. And at the same stage, by the same token, younger employees and older employees also often have different interests in whether they're trying to, build an income and experience and skills, or whether they're trying to build wealth for for an exit or for retirement, something like that. So I think they're both used as controls at this point, but we haven't seen the data back to know how they affect everything.
Great, thanks, Zeb, and thanks everybody for some great questions. Let me hand back to Jess.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Zeb and Andrew, for a fantastic presentation, and thank you, everyone, for the engagement and participation. It's wonderful to see, and I'm sure we'll be sharing more in due course from Zeb and Andrew on their research and anything else that we can learn from them. If you have any other webinar ideas for EOA, anything that you'd like to see or you'd like to talk about in terms of, it could be executive or all employee plans for big global companies, or employee ownership structures for small business succession, or anything in between, then we'd love to hear it. Thanks again, and we'll be in touch soon with the email sending this webinar recording to everyone who registered. Thank you.